Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Sinister Bookstore. The coastal town of Ryde on the Isle of Wight was a sleepy, charming place, filled with winding cobblestone streets, salty sea air, and the occasional tourist. But none of them knew about the dusty spine, a small, forgotten bookstore hidden in a quiet alleyway. It wasn't listed on any map and drew little attention, yet it had been in Holly Arnold's family for generations. After inheriting the shop from her late grandmother, Holly had moved to the Isle to take care of it. She was drawn to its old, creaky charm, its worn-out shelves stacked with books so old the spines crumbled to the touch. But the real intrigue came from what lay beneath. One stormy autumn evening, when the coastal winds howled like ghosts outside, Holly sat behind the counter. She ran her finger over the ledger. Her grandmother kept a diary of the shop's most peculiar acquisitions. There were mentions of rare volumes and cryptic notations Holly had never understood. As lightning flashed outside, casting brief, jagged shadows across the room, Holly's curiosity piqued. She recalled her grandmother's words, spoken in a hoarse whisper on her deathbed, "Stay out of the basement." For years, Holly had resisted the pull of that forbidden place. But tonight something felt different. The power flickered, the air in the shop thickened, and it was as if the building itself was beckoning her down the narrow staircase. The key to the basement, tarnished and old, hung on a hook beside the cash register. She had stared at it many times, but tonight her hand trembled as she reached for it. The stairs creaked ominously as Holly descended, each step feeling like a descent into another world. The smell hit her first: dust, mildew, and something deeper, like the scent of time forgotten. A flashlight beam flickered against the cold stone walls, illuminating old shelves filled with books her grandmother had hidden away. Some had bindings made from what looked like animal hide, others were blackened with age. At the back of the room, a shelf stood apart from the rest, veiled by a thick, musty curtain. Pushing the fabric aside, Holly's breath caught in her throat. The books on this shelf were unlike any she had seen before. Their covers were etched with strange symbols, glyphs that seemed to move if she stared too long. One book, larger than the rest, sat in the center, its spine thick with wear, its cover blank save for the inscription, "The Fates Unwritten." Against her better judgment, Holly reached for it. The moment her fingers touched the leather-bound cover, a shiver ran down her spine. The air around her turned cold, and the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening bang. Heart pounding, Holly tried to step back, but the book in her hand felt glued to her skin. Its pages fluttered open on their own, revealing text written in a language she didn't understand. The words seemed to whisper as they moved across the page, rearranging themselves before her eyes. One word stood out, glowing with an unnatural light: a listener. Before Holly could react, the room began to change. Shadows shifted and stretched, forming shapes that didn't belong in the real world. The walls warped, and suddenly Holly found herself standing not in the basement of the bookstore, but in the middle of a dark forest. The towering trees loomed over her like silent sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. She spun around, but the door was gone. The basement had vanished. Holly called out, her voice swallowed by the thick fog that crept along the forest floor. She clutched the book tightly, hoping it would offer some explanation, but it remained as inscrutable as ever. A rustling sound came from the trees behind her, followed by the distinct sound of footsteps. Holly asked, though she dreaded the answer. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate. Holly's heartbeat quickened. The fog parted slightly, and through the mist she saw a figure, a woman in tattered clothing, her face hidden beneath a veil of dark, matted hair. The figure moved with an eerie grace, each step echoing through the silent forest. Holly demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it lifted a bony hand and pointed at the book in Holly's hands. Her mouth, hidden beneath her hair, moved, and a raspy voice whispered, "You've opened the door." Before Holly could respond, the woman's form began to shift, her body elongating, her limbs twisting into grotesque shapes. Her fingers became talons, her eyes glowing with a malevolent light. With a horrifying shriek, the creature lunged toward Holly. Instinctively, Holly turned and ran, her feet pounding against the earth as she weaved through the trees. The forest seemed to go on forever, an endless maze of gnarled branches and shifting shadows. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, the creature was there, relentless in its pursuit. Panting, Holly stumbled upon a clearing. In this center stood an old, decrepit cabin, its wooden walls covered in moss and rot. Desperate for shelter, she threw herself through the door, slamming it shut behind her. The inside of the cabin was dark, the only light coming from a flickering candle on a rickety table. Holly leaned against the door, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The book was still in her hands, its pages fluttering as though alive. She knew, deep down, that this book was the key to her escape or her doom. The cabin creaked around her, the floorboards groaning under some unseen weight. And then she heard it, the low, raspy breathing of something on the other side of the door. Without thinking, Holly opened the book again, desperately flipping through the pages. The words shifted and danced, forming new patterns, new incantations. One phrase caught her eye: to close what has been opened, the price must be paid. The cabin's wall shook, and the door began to splinter as the creature clawed at it from the other side. Holly had no idea what the price was, but she knew she didn't have much time. With trembling hands, she placed the book on the table and whispered the incantation aloud. As the last word left her lips, a deafening silence fell over the cabin. The door stopped shaking, the creature's rasping breath ceased, and for a moment Holly thought it was over. But then she felt a sharp, icy pain in her chest. She looked down and saw her hand beginning to wither, her skin turning grey and brittle. The price, she realized, was her. The book had demanded a sacrifice, and now it was taking her life in exchange for sealing the horror she had unleashed. The last thing Holly saw before the world went out was the book, glowing faintly on the table, its pages turning once more as it awaited its next victim. The dusty spine remained closed after Holly's disappearance. Locals whispered about her sudden vanishing, and the few who ventured near the shop claimed to hear the faint rustle of pages turning, deep within its cursed basement. Weeks passed after Holly Arnold's mysterious disappearance, and the dusty spine stood untouched, its wooden door sealed tightly as though the store itself were guarding its secrets. No one in Rye dared approach it, save for the occasional drifter who had heard the rumors and was drawn by curiosity. Most would only peer through the dusty windows, but none ever ventured inside until one cold October evening, when the front door creaked open on its own. The person who entered was a newcomer to the Isle of Wight, a man named Richard Harper. He had heard of the dusty spine through an article on forgotten bookshops, one that mentioned the peculiar disappearance of its last owner, Holly Arnold. Richard was an antiquarian, obsessed with rare and obscure volumes, and the story of Holly and her store fascinated him. He pushed open the door, stepping into the darkened space, his breath visible in the chill air. The smell of old books and mildew clung to the room, thick and stifling. The soft glow of his flashlight swept over the shelves, revealing volumes that hadn't been touched in months. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed by his presence, and Richard felt a strange pressure, as though the air itself had weight. The deeper he moved into the shop, the more uneasy he became. He had visited countless old bookstores in his life, but the dusty spine felt different. It felt alive. A faint sound echoed through the shop, like the soft rustle of paper. Richard paused, straining his ears. The noise came again, from somewhere beneath his feet. The basement, he thought, remembering the rumors he had heard in town. Whispers of a secret section of the shop where Holly had found something that had led to her vanishing. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he searched behind the counter, his hands trembling as he brushed aside a stack of papers. There, hanging on a rusty nail, was an old, tarnished key. With a deep breath, Richard crossed the shop and found the door to the basement. It was slightly ajar, the smell of damp stone wafting up from below. He hesitated for a moment, considering turning back, but his curiosity got the better of him. He had come this far, he had to know what lay below. The steps creaked under his weight as he descended into the darkness. His flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The basement was just as Holly had left it. Rows of ancient, forgotten books lined the shelves, their covers thick with dust and age. But it was the far wall that drew his attention. The curtain was still there, slightly parted, revealing the forbidden section of the store. Richard approached it cautiously, his fingers trembling as he pulled the fabric aside. And there it was, the Fates Unwritten. The book sat on the shelf and touched, as though waiting for him. Its leather cover gleamed faintly in the dim light, the strange glyphs etched into its surface almost seeming to pulse with life. Richard swallowed hard, his mouth dry. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but something deeper, something darker, compelled him to reach out and touch the book. The moment his fingers brushed the cover, the air in the room shifted. A cold wind swept through the basement, though there were no windows or doors to let it in. Richard's flashlight flickered again, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Heart racing, Richard fumbled for his phone, trying to find some light. But before he could switch it on, the book opened of its own accord, the pages fluttering wildly as though caught in an unseen wind. Words in that same shifting, unreadable language filled the page. But this time there was no glow. The pages seemed darker, like ink had bled from the book and into the very air around him. A voice, low and guttural, whispered from the shadows, "You've come for the truth, and now it will be written." Richard froze, his blood turning to ice. He hadn't spoken, but the book responded as though it had read his thoughts. He stepped back, but the book followed him, his pages twisting and contorting, the words rearranging themselves into something legible. "The fate of those who open the book is bound to the story within. Beware the price." The words glowed faintly for a moment before vanishing into the page. Then silence. Richard stood there, shaking, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had to leave, he had to get out of this cursed place. But as he turned to run, the basement seemed to warp around him. The shelves twisted, the walls bent in unnatural angles, and the stairwell was gone. Instead, he found himself standing in a large, open field. The air was thick with fog, and the sky above was a strange, sickly green. He spun in circles, trying to find a way out, but the landscape was endless. There were no landmarks, no path, nothing but the oppressive fog and the silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Then came the footsteps. Soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. They came from behind him, slow and deliberate, much like the ones Holly had heard. Richard's heart raced as he began to walk, then jog, then run. But no matter how fast he moved, the footsteps followed, closing in on him with a relentless pace. He didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the presence behind him, growing closer, cold fingers reaching for him through the mist. And then a hand ice cold and skeletal grasped his shoulder. Richard screamed, spinning around to face the thing chasing him, but there was no one there. Only the fog, thick and choking, wrapping around him like a shroud. The last thing Richard saw before his vision blurred was a shape in the mist, a figure, feminine, with long, matted hair and hollow, glowing eyes. And then everything went black. Days later, the townspeople of Ryde noticed something strange. The dusty spine, long abandoned and forgotten, had been mysteriously cleaned. The windows were no longer fogged with dust, and the door stood open, as though inviting someone inside. In the window display sat a new book, its leather cover gleaming faintly in the dim autumn light. The title, "The Fates Unwritten." No one knew where it had come from, but those brave enough to glance inside claimed they could see two names etched into the first page, Holly Arnold and Richard Harper. The bookstore had found new stories, and it was always hungry for more. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day.